We have Ashley Warner, Mark Lopez, Monica Schenker, and Penny Newman. Please join us. So while my computer starts up again, and while we get situated, I just wanted to mention, so I'm super lucky to moderate this panel. There's some fabulous people up here. We only have 45 minutes, so we're going to try as much as possible to be succinct, and I will let you know, two panelists, that if you're going on a little too long, I will cut you off. So just help us in having an engaging conversation and trying to keep it as much into talking points. The problem with panels like these is that there's so much rich information to share. And so I'm trying to keep my questions also as specific as possible. The other thing I'd like to just remind us all is that when you're asking your questions or talking, to speak slowly so that our interpreters can understand and interpret it clearly.
Speak slow, quickly.
Slow. So yeah, slow, punchy.
My name is Ashley Warner. I'm an attorney with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability based in Fresno. We work throughout the Central Valley and Coachella Valleys to try to transform the fundamental conditions that are excluding the communities we work in, the most disadvantaged, vulnerable communities, low-income communities of color, from the resources and amenities and engagement in the political processes that are necessary to thrive. So I mean, the fundamental theory of change for us is that residents need to be front and center in social movements, and that government needs to be transformed to respond to residents' priorities.
Thank you.
Fast but succinct. That's so good. Hi everyone, my name is Monica Schenker. I work with an organization called Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles. We're based here in LA, but we do a lot of statewide work as well. We're an environmental health organization, and what's sort of unique about us, or what we really are grounded in, is the fact that we have a membership base of health professionals. So we work with physicians, we work with nurses, and oftentimes they're sort of the folks who really help us elevate a lot of the recommendations we have around policy and the change we would like to see in communities. But on the flip side of that as well, we're very adamant about going in as a policy organization that is really trying to elevate what communities really want. So in every single step of the way, whenever we have an issue, we have a whole range of issues that we work on, from air quality to climate change to land use issues. We're always side by side with community organizations trying to understand what the community really wants, and that's where we really ground a lot of our policy solutions.
My name is Mark Lopez. I'm with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, and we're an organization that builds community and movement in East LA, Southeast LA, and Long Beach. And the way we do that is by building a very powerful grassroots leadership in our communities. And so we're focused on building community experts, and more recently also building technical experts. So kind of getting folks to build their public speaking skills, advocacy skills, to understanding different chemicals that are in our communities and how to identify them, how to report them, and now doing original research so that we can potentially move policy agendas forward. So we do that in an intergenerational and intercultural way. And actually wanted just real quick to give a shout out to the Ceja staff, because I don't know if anyone's giving them a shout out today, but this is amazing to have all these folks here. And I see them working really hard even out here, so I want to make sure to give it up.
Oh, you scored points there.
I want more brownies, that's all.
I'm Penny Newman. I'm with the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. We're out in the Riverside, San Bernardino County, 27,000 square miles of territory. It's huge. The way that we work is really identifying communities, low-income communities of color, and helping with communities develop their skills and their community capacity to be the voice for themselves. And I think that's really the fundamental piece of what we do. The issues that we work on are identified by those communities. They are the priorities they put together, and they are the driving force for that. And we're getting everything coming our way from LA and Orange County and even San Diego So we're really on a defensive mode, but also trying to be proactive and driving back what our communities want.
Great. So, it seems like for all of the groups represented here, impacted communities are sort of front and center of your strategy. And relating that to green zones, thinking about local policy solutions for investment into our communities. I wanted to actually ask Mark to start us off to talk about an example of green zones work or policy that you've done with membership from East Yard.
Yeah, so I guess to give another shout out, I think Angelo Logan is still in the back of the room, somewhere back there. East Yards, as part of the kind of collaborative working on green zones or KUHU here in LA, really started this work years ago and years before I even joined the organization as a member. Really trying to vision how do we move from constant battles against individual facilities or companies to how do we change policy to prevent even having to go into those battles. And so in the City of Commerce, I mean, it really did take our members meeting with elected officials, educating elected officials, because as much as a lot of this stuff was being made up, and so we had to educate ourselves and then educate decision makers and build grassroots support for the policy, right? We had to raise the visibility of support in the communities, go door to door, get people to try to understand what is very complex policy, but understand the kind of principles behind it, right? I think once people understood that, then we can get them to come out to public meetings, we can get them to put yard signs out and really raise the visibility of support that eventually got us the votes to approve the policy. I think if I could share a challenge, I think as Penny mentioned, a lot of our communities are facing multiple issues all at once. And so sometimes they even become competing issues, right? And so what we've kind of witnessed in the City of Commerce is kind of staff dragging their feet in implementation because there's a Walmart that wants to come into our communities, right? And understanding that our Green Zones policy stands to prevent something like Walmart from coming into our communities. And so it wasn't until a vote recently happened at the City Council, a 3-2 vote approving the Walmart project, which of course, as we know, doesn't mean it's gonna happen, right? Fight's not over. But it wasn't until after then that the city staff started to answer our questions that we had been asking for months and even over a year about progress on our Green Zones policy. So now they're gonna hire somebody to do a lot of the elements of the Green Zones policy, right? But it wasn't until after that vote went in. So unfortunately, a lot of these issues aren't straightforward. And so it just becomes that much more difficult to actually make them work, right? As Penny mentioned, we have to keep fighting all the way through the victory, through the implementation, and through making sure that it doesn't get killed down the line.
Yeah, great, thank you. So moving to Penny, actually, you mentioned that 38 years of the organization, right, often fighting defensive battles. Can you talk about, through an example of a Green Zones project, how you've been able to develop more proactive solution?
Yeah, I think every mother in the room can identify what it is. I mean, you're fighting defensively, you're doing one thing like cleaning up a mess while you're trying to keep the kids from making a new mess. And so multitasking takes on a totally different perspective, 3D. And so what we've tried to do is, deal with, we have a toxic waste site in Jurupa Valley in the little community of Glen Avon, California's top priority Superfund site. Well, we still have it. It's 400 years before it's cleaned up. So we're dealing with that. But in the meantime, we're getting all of the port's warehouses where they're trying to get everything through the ports quickly. Well, they have to go somewhere. So they're going to these 1 million square foot warehouses that are taking up our agricultural land. So we've gone from a rural community to a highly industrialized community in the matter of literally 3 years. We saw this transformation. And so while trying to stop that from happening, making sure we're still not getting polluted from the hazardous waste site, and that we deal with the the diesel emissions that are impacting our families. How do we move forward to impact decisions and land use decisions that are being made now? And so it really became a very difficult way of juggling all of that. So one of the things we decided was clearly land use decisions are the decisions that create EJ communities, where we put things. So we decided to start looking at a new way of kind of looking at this. We somehow had to get the agencies multitasking. I mean, we have agencies that deal only with air, we have those that deal with toxic waste sites, we have those who deal with transportation. How do you get them all together so that we're not having to bounce from one to the other trying to coordinate them on our own? So what we've done is created the community platform. They've identified what they wanted, and we brought to the agencies together in a task force. So we had EPA, ARB, DTSC, for better or worse, AQMD, some of the local agencies who meet with the community people. They are driving the agenda. They are the ones then that outline what they want the agencies to do. And so instead of just getting, that's not our job, the question became, okay, what can you contribute to the overall picture? Because the community is the one that's being impacted by all of it. So what do you contribute? And one of the interesting things we saw was that they started to compete. ARB would come forward with funding to do something, putting air filters on the schools in the high polluted areas. And then DTSC was, well, we have funding too. And we can use our SEPs over here to do such and such. And so we started being able to compile some money. So as a result of that, we were able to put high-performance air filtration units on 7 schools. We were able to get the Attorney General to join us in a CEQA lawsuit, stopping a warehouse at the fence line of homes. But it didn't just stop there. We made those into a business park. We then were able to get a high-performance air filtration on 103 homes that were affected directly. We got a restricted truck route, which is going through its final stages right now, that takes 800 trucks an hour away from these impacted homes. That's a huge reduction. And it has resulted in the new city of Harupa Valley, it's the newest city in the state of California, has adopted the EJ element, in which they identify the affected areas, the disproportionately impacted communities. They have to outline a plan on how they're going to reduce the pollution burden and bring in the resources into the community. They develop a new way of looking at how do you involve these neighbors into the decision making. So all the meetings are not held at City Hall, but are in the neighborhood themselves. They have adopted as a conditions for permits for any of the development, any home development coming in that is within 1,000 feet of the freeway, has to create a buffer, has to have a vegetative barrier, has to have high performance filtration. Just one example.
Thank you, and apologies for cutting that conversation short.
You're good.
So, the way that Mark was talking about sort of understanding that there's no straightforward solution, we're really looking at policies as well as land use decisions and thinking about implementation strategies. And sometimes we have to go towards a legal route, right? So I'd like to actually toss it over to Leadership Council to actually just talk a little bit more about the organizing strategy, the research that y'all do, and how it relates sometimes to impact litigation that y'all can expand upon.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, first and foremost, our strategy of change is working with communities, building relationships with residents. It's all fundamentally about relationships. Our relationships with residents, connecting residents to the decision-making processes that impact their lives and their ability to effectively engage them, and them directly hold decision makers accountable. Part of our theory of change is we use all of the tools in our toolkit, both within our in-house toolkit, and we work in coalitions, recognizing we're stronger together. We need to work together, and using research as well. And so occasionally that means we need to resort to litigation when all else fails. Because relationships are so central to our work, We're very selective on when litigation can be used as a tool, and especially acknowledging that often litigation is not the best route forward. It takes a really long time to resolve, it's uncertain, there's risk, and it's a really big burden on residents. Residents who agree to be a part of that process are really, agreeing to subject themselves and open their lives up to really intensive discovery processes that we can't control once it starts. So we need to be really respectful of residents and really cautious when approaching that route. But an example, which you'll probably hear more about tonight if you stay for the celebration, is in the case of Matheny Tract. We have a resident group we work with there called Matheny Tract Committee, and Matheny Tract is a small, disadvantaged, unincorporated community located outside of the city of Tulare in Tulare County. And anybody's not sure where that is, it's the county directly south of Fresno. And so that community was originally formed as a farm worker community. African Americans who moved up from the south during the Great Migrations, Latinos who came for farm work in the valley were not allowed to live within City of Tulare city limits because of racially discriminatory policies. And so this community was formed without access to the most basic services that we all expect. So there was no potable water in the community, and residents relied on wells that were contaminated with. California recognizes this human right, and you also have a contract, and you have to comply with it. So that was a case where we used litigation, but we also used it in coordination with state policy and worked collaboratively with other community organization partners and residents to get Senate Bill 88 passed, which gave the State Water Board authority to force the city of Tulare to provide clean drinking water. So using these two tools with our resident engagement as the base, we were able to actually get the clean drinking water turned on in Matheny in June. So that was a really wonderful example of how all these strategies come together to create really, really important change and to really make us live up to, what we expect in the United States for all residents.
Great. So tossing it to Monica quickly, so I wanted to actually ask you specifically related to research and thinking about coming from a more health perspective. I think we all sort of know that we don't live single issue lives, right? But really specifically drilling down on physician first social responsibilities, toxins and environmental health ethic. Can you talk about how that's worked in the green zones and the areas that you're working in LA?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that also requires a little bit of insight as to where I'm working, just because I'll connect the dots. So I work in Watts in South LA, and we started that work by listening to one of our partners who was working more concretely within housing justice work in the Jordan Downs community, which is a 700-unit low-income housing unit. It's public housing that's going to end up getting demolished and then turned into a mixed-use, mixed-income community in the next year or so. And the reason our housing partners brought us on board is because next to this community is a 21-acre brownfield that's extremely contaminated and had been for a very long time. And so that brownfield was going to be part of the redevelopment of this community, and we wanted to make sure that it was done right, that it wasn't going to harm any of the nearby residents as well as the students that go to Jordan High School just south of there. As the redevelopment was happening, as the remediation was happening, and into the future when they put new housing on top of this brownfield. So that's a little bit of background on Jordan Downs. We've also been kind of spreading some of that work out Watts-wide to look at contamination in soil, what's in the air, what's in the water. But in terms of sort of the way we approach this work from an environmental health perspective and specifically grounded in sort of the type of data that we need, one of the things we realized early on is that it's really hard to push for the policies that you want if you don't have the information to back up all of the claims you're trying to make, right? Like the recommendations that we're trying to put forward with relevant agencies. And so one of the things we decided very early on with our partners is that we want to be the owners of the information and all the data that exists around environmental health in Watts. We want to be able to kind of have a repository, a central repository of information that we then end up using as part of our argument. And so what that really ended up launching was a series of things. And one of the things in the field of health that we work in is several sort of health-related actions. We started with health talks. So if a resident is living next to a brownfield and they're breathing in dust, but they don't know that there's lead in that dust, or arsenic in that dust, or cadmium in that dust. They don't know why they're having health symptoms. And so we had a health talk. What does it mean to live in a neighborhood where you're exposed to lead and arsenic? What are the symptoms of lead and arsenic? We brought our doctors on board who can actually have a one-on-one conversation with those residents living in the public housing of how do you remediate lead from your community, but also your body. Or if you have a child that has like a 10 or 11 level of lead in their body, how do you get that out? That was the first step. And then we realized, well, there's a whole bunch of other issues because there's a huge cumulative burden score in this community. It's in the top 5% in all of California, according to the Cal Enviro Screen. What else is really ailing this community? And so we went into a series of about 5 health talks that culminated in a giant health fair that we had in July. And we realized we actually need even more information than just that. And so we did a health needs assessment that's ongoing now, and that's Watts-wide. And so that's what sort of us as an environmental health organization try to bring to the table. We collect this information, we work with the community to try to figure out how do you bring those resources to that community so that they can feel co-powered to then advocate for their own health and well-being. Yeah, I guess I'll end there. I hope I answered your question. Also, litigation sounds fun.
You just said co-powered. I've never heard that. That's awesome.
That's a leadership council term. I heard that from
That's so
Veronica
awesome.
Garibe. I was like, that's the coolest term ever. Because otherwise, it sounds like I'm trying to empower you, which is not what I'm trying to do.
That's awesome. So actually, a lot of the things that you all mentioned really brought up for me just this idea of not only an intergenerational strategy. I really liked hearing a little bit more from Mark about sort of coming up as a member and now being a part of the organization as staff. But I do feel like some of the things that we experience at Scope are just some significant challenges related to redevelopment and displacement. We've talked about that this morning actually in a panel. So I wanted to hear from each of y'all's perspective, what are sort of the most significant barriers to a local green zones policy or any challenges that you can describe? And maybe try and stick to your top 1 or 2. And why don't we go ahead and start with Mark actually?
If I had to just pick one off the top of my head, biggest barrier might be election cycles. That, you know, we have decision makers, and decision makers are directly influenced by who's going to buy their yard signs and who's going to buy their mailers. And especially in Southeast Los Angeles, there's what many people have described as a mafia. So I've heard. And so they're Southeast Los Angeles is very well known for having significant corruption cases in pretty much every city in the Southeast, and it continues to be pervasive. And so I think that that is still a very big issue in our community. So on top of the straightforward we're getting poisoned, there is a real undermining of democracy with a little d, because I guess that's how democracy with a big D works, right?
So maybe move on to Ashley. What's happening in Central Valley?
Well, so as far as challenges and barriers, I would say apathy. You know, I think in all of our communities, it's a crisis what's happening. Under Cal Enviro Screen in Fresno, the top 3 census tracts, so they're the most burdened by multiple sources of environmental pollution and the most vulnerable are in West Fresno. And that community has also been identified in studies as having the most highly concentrated poverty in the United States. It's 98% people of color. So there is like a real crisis in that community. So if we had a government that really cared about that crisis, if we had decision makers that were really in touch with residents, this would be front and center on our agenda every day, and we would have really strong proactive policies and funding allocated to address it. Obviously that's not what we see, so it's a constant everyday effort working with nonprofits and residents to push it forward and to frame it as a crisis and make people understand that it is. And I think it's learning how to effectively use our power as nonprofits. We have a lot of resources, or not only as nonprofits, but the whole spectrum of community interest organizations, labor groups, educational institutions, and understanding our shared interests and the strength when we work together, and really finding the ways that we need to support each other and effectively use our voices. So I think those are a few of them.
Great, we can move to Monica.
Just one. Can I mention two?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with the first one I think is pretty challenging for our community is just fear-based tactics. Like the over-policing of this community is ridiculous. I remember once we had a health talk and barely any residents showed up, and the reason is because the night before they had an ice raid and people were scared to leave their homes. So it's just very frustrating when agencies and government and even certain community organizations take tactics that are really fear-based and keep the whole community from engaging actively in the transformation of their own community. And then I guess from like the health side, I'll say that I really get frustrated by very unprotective health standards at this point. I mean, if you just take lead on its own, right? Like right now, I think the CDC just most recently changed their standards to 5 micrograms per deciliter, but I think that in California they use 10, and then above 10 is when you actually start getting a little bit concerned. But there is no safe level of lead for children, for example, and in this community you have over 50% being under the age of 18, and of those are under the age of 10. So how can you make the argument that this is health protective if you have massive amounts of lead in this community? And I don't think that that only applies to lead. There's multiple contaminants that have the exact same sort of very, very unprotective health standards that we really need to take a good hard look at.
Penny?
I overwhelmingly, it's the institutionalized racism that is the biggest challenge. It's what's created those conditions. It is what has laid out our communities. And when you push back, it's the first weapon that is used against our communities. So by far, that is it. When you look at in the Inland Empire, we probably could challenge the corruption going on pretty easily. When you look at the Inland Empire, you see 2 stratas of society. You have the decision makers who are overwhelmingly wealthy and white, and you have the communities who are overwhelmingly communities of color and low income. And so the people really feeling the impacts have very little to do with the decision making that is taking place. I think trying to switch that with the demography that has changed, the demographics are changing. We're a majority minority now, and we could take over. It's like when I was teaching junior high, the joke among the teachers were if they ever find out that they outnumber us, we're in trouble. And I think that's what's going on. And so we need to make sure that they are in trouble and that we turn out to vote, that we mobilize people, that we get them involved. And probably the first step, the first obstacle is people feel hopeless. On the west side, they tell us nothing has changed in 90 years, why would it now? And so our biggest challenge was to bring a victory to them that was concrete, that was tangible, that they could touch, so that they could see we did that. And once you do that, then it takes off.
So if you all had to leave us with some opportunity that you see over the next couple of years, whether it's grounded in a particular policy or in something that's happening in your neighborhood, what sort of brings you hope? What is that for you? We can actually start with Penny.
I think the one thing that I think has some institutional movement to it is SB 1000 that we have this year, carried by Senator Connie Leyva, that would establish an EJ element within general plans. It mandates that cities, counties have to have an EJ element and address those goals and objectives, which means each city has to identify their hard-hit communities, and we've got Cal and Screen there to help them, and then develop a plan going forward to reduce that pollution, to bring in the resources, and they have to come back and revisit that. I think that kind of policy, if cities won't recognize what they're doing, they're not going to solve it. If we force them to recognize it, it's something that we can point to and say, you're not doing this. And so I think it has some power to it. I think it has the ability to help communities organize and really bring about some transitional change here.
Let's go down the line.
I think in investing in young folks, I think I saw some youth edgers here mixing the crowd. I see folks from Poder, who I believe also might have brought some young folks down. I think every hour we invest in young folks multiplies by 20. That hasn't been scientifically proven, but agencies be saying shit all the time too, so I think a lot of, I mean, I'm sure some of the folks in here were engaged as young folks and helped your trajectory to kind of where you're at now. So I do really think investing in young folks and helping build the movement will always move us forward.
Monica? So Penny stole mine, but that's okay, because I'll think of something else. I was actually also going to say, it's a small one, but I think if you're looking to either begin a green zone in your community or try to address some environmental justice issues, the EJ Small Grant is phenomenal. I mean, it was a really great sort of asset for us when we wanted to do some really awesome education in the community, and I would highly recommend folks look into that if they're looking for a little bit of funding. And then also, you know, in the vein of sort of engaging stakeholders, we had the tremendous, wonderful opportunity to build alliances with academic institutions, including, I think Vivian's in the room from CSU Dominguez Hills. And that's been just wonderful because a lot of the students from Dominguez Hills are straight out of the same neighborhoods that we oftentimes work with, and they know those neighborhoods very intimately. And so, you know, I think an opportunity always is to partner with incredible academics and see what that takes you.
I'll say 2 points and I'll say them briefly. So one, I think just continuing to build this movement, I think sustaining that is our, you know, it's our first and foremost way that we can create this change. And you know, every resident that we pull into the process and develop that relationship with, they have their whole network of contacts that they too can bring in. And so I think that's the first and foremost important opportunity we have in front of us. And I do think there is an increasing consciousness with the Black Lives Matter movement, the national media, and locally about the need to really start recognizing the racial and economic and social injustices in our communities. So I think there's great opportunity. And then I would say implementation. We've done a lot of work to get really great policies, and now there's a lot of opportunity to do really good implementation work. And part of that is especially with policies in documents like housing elements that do have legal requirements for implementation, so we can put pressure on our jurisdictions in many different ways, including legal pressure, but all the different tools that we have to do that.
Great. So I know that you all are probably feeling a little bit of like this after lunch slump, so I just want to like restate again this charge, because I think that you all brought up some really great opportunities. So take your notepad out and your pens, because there's a lot to talk about when it comes to SB 1000, really building the leadership and power of young people, and also others to contribute to our movement building, including allies within academia, as well as opportunities for funding, so the EJ Small Grant, I think that's the Cal EPA grant, and thinking about ways that we're implementing some of the policy solutions that we've already passed. So we are so good on time, can I just say? That's awesome. You guys are great. So I wanted to get folks to, you know, if you have any questions, please come up here and ask them. We'll sort of pause for that. Yes, come on up.
Okay, this question is for Mark. So I've been hearing you talk about, you know, working with the youth. I'm a strong believer that that's where a lot of our answers lie. But what are some of the strategies you're using, or the organization, to build intergenerational power in your organization across the EJ communities that you're working in? And how are you building organizational power ultimately?
Thank you. As an organization, we try to operate in a really flat way, which means decision making is horizontal. So the organization, if we're looking to make a decision as an organization, the youth have to have their dialogue and make a recommendation, and the adult members have to have dialogue and make their recommendation. And if those two are in conflict, then we need to bring folks together to resolve that, right? So I think everyone feels a shared sense of power, and for young folks, that's extremely important, right? That folks aren't tokenized, that folks aren't just, we're not just putting their face all over Facebook, right? They're having meaningfully they're meaningfully involved in the decision-making process of the organization. I think part of what we also do is we talk about the legacies of our communities a lot, the legacies of victories. And so folks know that this movement is built on folks who have been fighting for much longer than some of these young folks have been, right? And then just straight up bringing folks together sometimes for our programs. One example is we have a program called La Cosecha Colectiva, which is the collective harvest. So I won't go too much into detail, but that it started out of a dialogue in the fact that we live in a food apartheid, even though in the city of Commerce, all the like warehouses for all the markets in the region are there, but there's no market there, right? So the elders have the information, the skill sets for growing food, but maybe don't have the back strength anymore. Our young folks don't have the skill sets, but have a lot of energy, and so we bring folks together to build gardens in people's homes, and then we exchange the produce, right? So if there's 20 households that are producing, then each of the 20 households gets a little bit of the other households, right? We all kind of share in that way. And so I think in that way, our elders are seeing the energy from the youth and are motivated by that, and then the youth are also seeing the valuable contributions of our elders that maybe not physical strength or the amount of energy they're able to put in, but are bringing a lot of information to the movement. So those are some of the ways that we try to ensure that we're operating in an intergenerational way.
Before we go to the next question too, I wanted to open up the opportunity if anyone else had strategies for engaging youth that y'all are working on last time.
Yeah. I'll just give a quick one. Like a central component of how we engage community is using horas de café. So like in many local elementary schools, they'll have coffee hours that parents will attend. And what we find is it's almost all like Spanish-speaking mothers that come in the communities that we're working in. So it's mothers, and they're coming because they care about the future of their children. Is the express reason that they're stating that they're coming. They want to create opportunities for their children. So we always make sure in the meetings we do that there is space for their kids to come, that they can be a part of the meeting, they feel included, and that when we go to public hearings, kids can come too, and they have the opportunity to understand the processes and to make comments if they want. And so we've actually had a couple parents' kids really get interested and get involved and get plugged into opportunities, and it's really wonderful to see this leadership develop in them and awareness of the decision-making structures and that they can make a difference.
Are there questions from the audience?
I've been reflecting on this. I have a personal question because I think we have a lot of EJ advocates and justice warriors in the room. So I wanted to ask Penny, how would you recommend? I think all of us deal with a lot of personal situations and moments of crisis. What are some recommendations that you have for us to balance that conversation where we're having to do justice work 24/7?
Is this the elder question? I think that we need to look at the work we're doing not as a stress inducer, but as an opportunity. And I really believe that whatever is put in front of you, it's how you interpret it and how you put it back. So while it's extremely busy and there's a lot going on and it's heavy work, and you hear all of those stories and you go to the funerals and all of that, you also get to see people who, in spite of the obstacles that are put in front of them, in spite of not speaking the dominant language, in spite of having two jobs and trying to find time to step forward, that these good people step forward, not just for themselves, but for their communities. And day after day, they're there to fight. And so I think taking inspiration from that fact, I mean, I'm a white woman. I know that if I got tired of this, I could walk away. My life's not going to change. Most of you can't do that. It's you. And to see that kind of courage of seeing a young woman who has children, who stands up at a board meeting to speak on behalf of her kids, knowing that people are going to look down on her, that they're going to come back at comments that they're putting themselves in a vulnerable situation. They could be deported, that they still do it because it's the right thing to do and because they want their community to be better.